Right, so whilst most GCSE courses on Vietnam start in 1945, it's really important, obviously, to understand what Vietnam was like prior to 1945, because that basically sets the scene for what happens afterwards. Now, Vietnam was a French colony. It was taken by the French in the 1870s and 80s, and it became part of what was known as French Indo-China. Now, that was Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Now, the reason the French wanted Indochina was because of the rich or huge amount of raw materials there were there. There was coal, there was rubber, and in actual fact, Vietnam was the world's third largest producer of rice. So it was pretty wealthy, and obviously the French were pretty keen to keep hold of it and take the resources from it and the wealth and keep it as part of the French Empire. Now, the French were quite clever, and what they did was they put in place an emperor called Bao Dai. Again, apologies for the pronunciation. Bao Dai, Emperor Bao Dai. Now, whilst he had the name emperor, was essentially a French puppet ruler, which means he ruled in name only, whereas actually it was the French administrators, the French that controlled Vietnam and made the key decisions about it. Now, obviously, the Vietnamese weren't super happy about being a French colony, and there were rebellions. The major one was in 1930, and that was brutally suppressed, put down by the French. And the French had total control over Vietnam, essentially. Until 1939-1940, when the Second World War kicked off. And the French didn't do too well at the start of the First World War, and they were actually occupied and defeated by Germany. So obviously once the French were occupied by Germany, they couldn't control their colonies around the world. And that left it open for other countries to have a look and say, oh, which one do we fancy? And at this time, this coincided with the rise of Japan in Asia. And it was a very militarized, quite developed state for Asia. And in 1941, in July, the Japanese requested to the French to be able to move troops into French Indochina. Now, the French were in no position to refuse that, primarily because they were occupied and controlled by the Germans. So the Japanese moved into French Indochina, took it over, and took the resources. And a few months later, obviously in December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and that really kicked off the Second World War, with America joining, Japan and America declaring war, Germany declaring war on Japan, etc., etc., etc. So during the Second World War, French Indochina, Vietnam, was occupied by the Japanese. Again, not very popular with the Vietnamese themselves. At this time, 1940 odd, in Vietnam, there was a guy who came along who became very, very, very influential and very important, really super cool character from history, a man called Ho Chi Minh. Now, he was Vietnamese. He had left Vietnam. He'd worked in London in a hotel as a chef. He had worked as a political activist, or been a political activist in France. But he'd also gone to study in Russia, in Moscow, which was communist at this time. And he trained I need to get this straight, at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. It's a pretty catchy name. Don't think it quite exists today still. But essentially, it was a revolutionary training school, a university for revolutionaries. I don't think you'll find that on your UCAS choices, but there we go. So he studied in Moscow to be a revolutionary, and they were trained to help the people of the East, i.e. Asia, to resist imperialist oppression, i.e. Western capitalist powers making them colonies. Now, he returned to Vietnam in 1940, and he created something called the League for the Independence of Vietnam, now also known as the Viet Minh. Okay? The League for the Independence of Vietnam, the Viet Minh. Top tip, it's kind of important that you get that straight, because there's quite a lot of names that are a little bit similar and it can catch people out. So Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. And it was a resistance movement to the Japanese. And throughout the Second World War, the Viet Minh fought against the Japanese. They had a guerrilla war, and it wasn't just communists. Even though Mao had studied in Moscow, it wasn't just communists in the Viet Minh. It was anyone who wanted to get rid of the Japanese invaders. Okay? So it's made up of nationalists, anyone could join. Now, the Viet Minh themselves were actually very, very, very good. And by the end of World War II, 1945, the Viet Minh controlled most of North Vietnam, the northern half of it. They used guerrilla tactics against the Japanese troops. That meant they avoided big fixed battles where the Japanese could use their superior weapons to defeat them. And so they had like little sneak attacks and ambushes and booby traps, and they fought and they just dispersed and they met up later on and attacked again. Very, very, very clever. They were led militarily by a man called General Giap. Again, shocking pronunciation. G-I-A-P. Now, General Giap, brilliant, brilliant military leader, also a history teacher. So beware. So Ho Chi Minh was the political leader of the Viet Minh, and General Giap was the military leader. Right? Two very important guys. Always good to throw those names in to show good subject knowledge and understanding. All right. Now, by 1945, the Viet Minh had captured Hanoi, up in the north of Vietnam, and declared Vietnamese independence. We don't want the French back, we don't want the Japanese, it's Vietnam for the Vietnamese. All right. Funnily enough, the French weren't very happy. By 1945, though, their situation had changed because Japan and Germany had both been defeated in World War II, and France was on the side of the Allied victors. And they said, look, do you know what? We want our colonies back. So, the French returned to Vietnam. And that is the beginning of the First Indo-China War. When the French returned to Vietnam and the Viet Minh fight against them because they fought for independence against the Japanese, and now the French have turned up and the Viet Minh are like, hang on, we didn't just fight to get rid of the Japanese so the French could step in, let's resist them. That's the First Indo-China War. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes sense. Pretty straightforward, really. A couple of names to remember: Ho Chi Minh, General Giap, First Indo-China War, Viet Minh. All right, cool. Hope that makes sense. Bye.